the strategy that newspapers have historically pursued of labeling the sections we were talking about on the way up doesn't really seem to have worked. I mean, we label our whole thing opinion. We're like, we are a magazine of political opinion. And yet we do reporting. And so I routinely get tweets, letters, etc. from people saying, how dare you not share both sides in your reported piece? And it's like, that's not what we do. And so I think, to ask people to see that distinction on different pages of a newspaper, and even now when you don't even have the different physical pages, right? You're just clicking around on the site. I think it's actually asking too much of readers to appreciate and honor the sort of arcane professional codes that dictate those different forms. And I think it might be better actually to let that difference evaporate a bit and to let the idea of the objective journalist who just writes facts as a single unitary function go away.
Katherine Mangu-Ward is editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, a magazine of free minds and free markets. A few of her more memorable cover stories include a defense of plastic bags, an argument for why you almost certainly shouldn't vote, and a welcome to our new robot overlords. Reason Magazine is a libertarian publication leading with its slogan, Free Minds and Free Markets. Most of its coverage flows from that motto, and their claim is to provide a balanced coverage of issues central to the values of libertarianism. They make a principled case for liberty and individual choice in all areas of human activity. Well, I found it very interesting to just think about Reason as a magazine that has this loyal following and the voice that you've carved out in the industry, talking about the issues that you discuss. And I thought maybe because you're here in Boston, the bastion and beginning of the democracy of the country, can you define libertarian for us so it's understood?
Sure. So I actually used to define libertarian differently than I do now. I used to say socially liberal and fiscally conservative, but I don't actually think that means very much to anyone anymore, partially because American conservatives are no longer fiscally conservative. They are not worried about reducing government spending by and large or the scope of government. And I think socially liberal now, once meant an interest in defending civil liberties, but now can sometimes mean to people, an interest in, social safety net or social welfare programs. So I now say something more like what you read out there, which is that we look to maximize individual choice in all realms of life. The other thing I say is that Reason Magazine is devoted to defending the free movement of people and goods across borders, that trade and immigration are central to our political order and to our freedoms, and that that's something that we have been covering for a very long time. And that also includes, personal freedom at the individual level. So we are, significantly invested in reporting on the problems of mass incarceration and the need for criminal justice reform, as well as the end of the drug war.
Well, you've jumped ahead on me because one of my questions was, we look at old school Republicans and we always say they're fiscally conservative, pro-national security, and it seems like it's much more of a social movement in the things that they're following. How would you define a Republican Party today, and how are you different?
Yeah, so there also used to be an old joke that libertarians are just Republicans who like to smoke pot. And I think, for a certain type of 70s libertarians, you might have added and dodge the draft. But luckily, that's not a fight that we have as the country anymore. The modern Republican Party is a little bit of a mystery to me, in part because they still think libertarians are part of their coalition. And I really don't think libertarians see themselves that way at all at this point. I certainly don't. There was a time in the mid-20th century when conservatives and libertarians, or even Republicans and libertarians, were united in the common cause of opposing communism, right? And this is a dramatic, comical oversimplification of 20th century world history, so bear with me. But the idea that there was this sort of global force that was in opposition to American values, and that American Republicans or conservatives and libertarians would sort of unite against it and work out the details later about who gets to have sex with whom. that coalition has sort of fallen apart. And in part because that battle was won, although the 2020 election weirdly seems to be about socialism again, so I guess we can talk about that. But in part because the American Republican Party as it currently exists, as I mentioned before, doesn't actually seem at this point to be terribly invested in shrinking the size of the state. And to me, that is a central issue. That is one of the central issues of Reason magazine and of my career. When we have two major political parties, both of whom have very specific ideas about how everyone should live their lives, whether it's what wages they should earn or pay, or whether they should be allowed to have an abortion, or whether they should go to a certain amount of school, or who should pay for it. I think, my view is that libertarians now sit a little bit outside of that conversation, which can be marginalizing, but is also, I think, is an important role to kind of hold the Overton window open to keep a little space on this side for what was once, I think a relatively mainstream American view, and can be again that people want to be left alone.
At the same time, as you're trying to leave a bit of a window open and you're saying, where is the old GOP who used to believe in these things that we actually shared as libertarians and Republicans, there is a movement of more independence in this country. We have someone like Howard Schultz who's now decided he's going to run for president as an independent. We thought Bloomberg might run for president as an independent. Do you see a sort of land grab? Is there an opportunity here for libertarians? Is this a moment for you guys? How are you looking at this race? So
the phrase "the libertarian moment" was a thing for a hot minute. I don't know if any of y'all remember. Yeah. One of our writers actually did a piece a few months back. The headline was something like, "Hey socialists, don't get too excited. Take it from me, a libertarian who lived through the libertarian moment." Because I do think there is a sense, at the moment that the Tea Party was sort of early in its evolution, and it wasn't immediately clear at that point that it was going to become, again, a dramatic oversimplification, but kind of shift into a kind of populist Trumpian, and then in some senses even an alt-right movement. When there were people out on the mall, on the National Mall, holding up signs that seem to actually be demanding not only tax cuts, which Republicans love everywhere and always, but also cuts in government, which is, to my mind, a crucial thing that must always be paired with tax cuts. I think there was a thing that looked like the libertarian moment, and I think, unfortunately, it was actually just a sick of the status quo moment. And I think one way you can tell that is that those same people who tell pollsters that they're independents, and their numbers are growing, that's absolutely true, but the same people who tell pollsters they're independents, when you probe their underlying policy views, they're totally incoherent. And that's not surprising because most Americans' underlying policy views are totally incoherent. That is a thing about humans.
Meaning that you can't categorize them into one or the other?
Meaning that they believe A and not A. They believe impossible things. They want more social safety nets. They also want lower taxes and smaller government. They want more free trade. They also want more American manufacturing. They want they want lots of things that you can't always have simultaneously.
So maybe they're unrealistic.
I'd go with incoherent, but yeah. Thomas Massey, the senator from Kentucky, actually had a great quote about it, and I don't think I can say all the words he used on the televisions, but he basically said that when he and his libertarian colleagues on the Hill did well electorally, they thought it was a sign that America was ready for libertarianism, and actually they were just voting for the craziest person in the room. I will let you fill in what word he used there instead. And Donald Trump has best in category by far.
Reason has sections along the mast. I was saying to you, when we're in digital speak, is it the masthead or is it the categories? And you said you guys have a term for it.
We just jokingly, we call them the mega topics, as if they're like a transformer where all the topics come together and form the mega topic. But
so the mega topics on Reason, when I was looking at it this week, is there's a category called Donald Trump. Then there's election 2020, immigration, mass shootings, Green New Deal. When you choose those as your mega topics, who are you trying to reach?
Oh,
what
so
are you trying to cover?
So actually, those are not the mega topics. Those are just the topics that happen to be live on the site at that moment. Those are auto-generated by our software. So those are just the tags of the most popular stories on the site at that moment.
Trending mega
Those are trending. We do have also along the top of the site are kind of what we think of as our big issue areas, which we divide there into stuff like civil liberties, free speech, government reform. So there's another layer of stuff up there.
So civil liberties, free speech, government reform.
Those are the three that...
I mean, there are like 6 or something, but
those are 3 that would be kind of on topic for you guys.
yeah, I mean, we see those as the core of what we cover. I mean,
so when you see it trending as Donald Trump, election 2020, immigration, mass shootings, Green New Deal, is that surprising to you? I'm just trying to get a sense of like who's reading.
Yeah. So one thing that we actually find that's a bit of a new finding for us, of course, we have just insanely large amounts of data about who reads what. We get just an onrush of information every day. One thing that we've discovered is that our content that does well is almost always weaponizable by the left or the right. And so one thing that we think about is like, okay, well, first of all, is that what we want? And then second, well, is it a good day if something's weaponized by both sides on the site? Because we've always for years joked, it's a good day when you get hate mail accusing you of being a commie and a fascist at the same time, right? When you get hate mail from both sides. Now, it's a bit gallows humor. Ideally, we would get only fan letters praising us for our commitment to classical liberal virtues. But we, for instance, on any given day on the site, will often have, as our most popular stories, a reported piece about, for instance, overcriminalization. So a piece about how in Chicago the law enforcement is impounding cars under civil asset forfeiture laws and selling them to close a budget gap in the city's budget, right? And that's a reported piece that we put a lot of work into that like makes the rounds. That's typically going to be shared by people on the left. There's a racial justice angle, there's a criminal justice angle. Original reporting draws people in. On the flip side, we'll also have a piece of original reporting about a free speech controversy on campus or a Title IX controversy on a campus. And that's going to be shared exclusively by the right. That one's being powered by a Ben Shapiro retweet. So for us, we think a lot about what it means to live in this weird place in the political spectrum where people on both sides see points of agreement and then they sign up for our newsletter and then are immediately horrified to discover that we don't agree with them on everything.
Do you try to do that mix? Because it does feel like you're the middle child.
Oh yeah, I'm desperate for attention. No, we try to do that mix not for its own sake. It's not a marketing strategy, right? It comes out of our underlying principle. Like we do that mix because we think those things are what's important. And we think that the people who are covering them from an exclusively partisan perspective or from a point scoring perspective are sometimes missing key parts of the story.
You wrote for some of the major magazines and newspapers. Do you think today's mainstream media is biased?
So this is a tale as old as time. I think this is.
Is it though? I mean, it's tales of old time the last decade, but.
I don't know. I mean, as a garbage undergrad, in a dorm room at 2 a.m., I remember talking about this. So, I think all journalists have opinions. And I think that the pretense on the part of some mainstream outlets to not have opinions is harmful and distorting and weird. One thing that we do at Reason, for instance, is we ask, though don't require, Libertarians, our staffers to disclose who they vote for. Nobody else does that except us and weirdly Deadspin.
That's cool.
Yeah. We do it, Slate used to do it also. We do it because we think it's not whether or not an institution is biased that matters, it's whether or not the bias is disclosed. So, in the same way that we disclose our funders, we publish everyone who funds us every year in the magazine. We give a big 2-page spread to it in the same way that we disclose who we vote for, in the same way that we disclose, just the fact that we are a magazine of opinion. I would rather see more of that.
I mean, that's the tenets of journalism. I don't think everybody needs to go to journalism school to be a journalist. I did go to one, and the tenets were that you're going to be transparent and you're going to be as balanced as you can. And I think one of the things you and I were talking about coming up is that you're an opinion magazine, and so much of society today seems very confused between op-ed writers and news. So if you're a straight journalist doing news, you of course bring bias to the table by where you were born, your gender, what you ate for breakfast, so you're going to bring those, but your job in news is just to lay out facts, whereas opinion writing is to give an opinion. And I wanted to know if you could maybe talk to us a little bit in this important moment when people are confused between the two, what we need to do as a society to talk about bifurcating news and opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the strategy that newspapers have historically pursued of labeling the sections we were talking about on the way up doesn't really seem to have worked. I mean, we label our whole thing opinion. We're like, we are a magazine of political opinion. And yet we do reporting. And so I routinely get tweets, letters, etc. from people saying, how dare you not share both sides in your reported piece? And it's like, that's not what we do. And so I think, to ask people to see that distinction on different pages of a newspaper, and even now when you don't even have the different physical pages, right? You're just clicking around on the site. I think it's actually asking too much of readers to appreciate and honor the sort of arcane professional codes that dictate those different forms. And I think it might be better actually to let that difference evaporate a bit and to let the idea of the objective journalist who just writes facts as a single unitary function go away. I think there are people who it's not how we've always done things, but the way we've always done things isn't always the best way.
Right. It's interesting because a lot of historians have jumped onto that right now, that if you look back at the time of the colonies and the making of America, tracts and pamphlets were used, and those were hyper partisan. Yeah. Newspapers tried to pivot to more news, and then when we ran into the Watergate moment, we really became this sort of straight news moment. Well, but I don't think I'm ready for us to throw out the tenets of like reporting, that you're just on the street getting both sides of the story versus a bunch of people on cable TV giving us really loud opinions.
I mean, I think I'd like to think that Reason is a testament to how you can have really loud opinions and still do the reporting. But I also think it's a little bit of a myth to say that there maybe was a golden age. And of course, you're right to refer to, the early days of the scandal sheets and all this. And, God knows it was just like accusing people of treason was just a normal Tuesday activity for the founding fathers, which is something to keep in mind. But I also think this sort of mid-century era of the kind of Walter Cronkite, this is the way it is, and the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, that was always a lie. I mean, it was always a very, very constricted news environment.
Well, it was I don't know if it's a lie, but it was certainly a curated selection.
It was a curated selection that was curated in part because of the fact that there were 3 broadcast networks, because of the fact that there was 1 or 2 local papers. It was curated because monopolies existed. And I think the breaking down of those monopolies gets us closer to truth than the idea that you can sort of constrict those monopolies with cultural norms and hope for the best.
So let's pivot to our tech and free speech, because some of us might argue, and I'll be one of those, that the tech age in California in the 90s was maybe the golden era. There was this promise of the internet. Everybody could share and connect and communicate, and you didn't just have to take what was fit to print by these monopolies. Everything was free. And then today, it's so loud and it's so polarized and there's so much garbage and hate. I'd like to talk about what you see as a solution, because I know you're very worried about free speech being stifled by government and Facebook deciding what is hate and what is free speech and what we can say. So can you just tell us a little bit about your thinking and where you think we need to go at this moment in time with technology and the public square?
Sure. So I want to start by saying lots of libertarians also have like a very deep and abiding sense of nostalgia about the early days of the internet. And this is the same thing that attracts lots of libertarians to space exploration. The idea of a frontier is very powerful, and it's particularly powerful for people who worry about social or governmental strictures stifling creativity and innovation. So the idea of a new space where people can try new things is, I think, it appeals to everyone, I think, particularly Americans, but especially libertarians. And I think the idea of the current cacophony being suboptimal is hard to deny, right? Like it doesn't feel like the thing we're doing right now is the best possible use of this resource. I do think we are right now at the end of the era of the free internet. And I think, the pressure on Section 230, which protects, it protects platforms from liability for what third-party users post on them, the sort of crackdown on personal sites and other adult sites under the aegis of stopping sex trafficking has been like FOSTA and SESTA has been a major kind of bite out of internet freedom. And then I think, when you see these, what are now basically a monthly ritual where a head of a tech company is called up to the Hill and everyone says like, why can't my grandson get the Minecrafts on my thing or something? And it's like all series of tubes and it makes me, I won't project onto you, but it makes me very concerned at the idea that this, lineup of people who are not experts, who frankly seem to maybe barely understand how the internet functions, Congress, is going to determine the future of the internet. And I think when you hear Mark Zuckerberg say, sir, we would be happy to work with you to write those regulations. That's bad. That's bad news. And I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because everyone should hate it from almost any place you're coming from. If you're skeptical of the state, which I am, then you say, I don't want tech companies to be involved in the making of laws because I think fundamentally the making of laws is going to wind up corrupting the space. If you're skeptical of big corporations, you should say, I don't want big corporations to be in charge of this thing and have the power of the state to use for their own ends. I think there's often a misapprehension about libertarians that we like big business. We don't. We like free markets, which is a very different thing. We like it when people can buy and sell goods and services as long as it is contractual and consensual with as few strictures as possible. And that's a very different thing than Mark Zuckerberg sitting down with Congress and writing regulations that set the rules of the game for everyone. That is not the thing that we are in favor of. And I think that this is, it's not specific to Facebook, right? This is true of any large player in an industry. There's rent seeking, there's regulatory capture, like
right. We
people.
don't want the insurance companies to write.
You don't want the insurance companies to write the healthcare bill, which happened a little.
So what do we do? Use reason and tell us what is a reasonable way to move forward, because we do have this kind of garbage dump happening on the internet, and people are saying enough loudness, enough disruption to children, enough of my privacy being taken from me, enough of not having control over my data. How do we move forward? What does a Libertarian and Reason magazine want to publish? What's the story you're dying to write? And by the way, I will give a plug. I loved your algorithm story in January.
Oh, thank you.
So I really recommend everybody read it.
Thank you. That was by our science correspondent, Ron Bailey, who basically just did a piece investigating the ways in which governments are using algorithms to guide decision-making, often algorithms that were built by private entities, and how that interaction and interplay is working out. I do want to tell you, though, we have a firm rule at our office, which is if someone makes a pun on the word reason, as you just did, we all have to take a shot.
Excellent.
It's a drinking game. So I just want you to know, I'm now down to 2 shots in the drinking game. It's a firm policy which I enforce as editor. Now,
so where are we going?
Right.
What do we do with this moment if we don't want Facebook, Twitter, and Google and Congress to sit down and write these laws?
Right. And this is a place where I I wish that I had a tidier answer. I think a lot of people are selling tidy answers to this problem right now, both literally selling it. They are selling products that theoretically will solve this problem by, gating your children's internet access or, automatically turning off your thing from ringing during panels. But I think, moreover, it's policymakers who are selling these solutions, and they're saying we're going to police the internet, make it safe, restrict it, and I think actually it's snake oil on both sides for the most part. And unfortunately, I think there's a sort of unsatisfying answer, which is if you don't like the way that social media platforms feel to you right now, you probably just have to get off them. You have to be a market block. And I think that that's always an unsatisfying answer. Everyone's makes the face that you're making right now. But
I think you can say that about social media. It's hard when it's infiltrated into camp forums and school forums and maps and your car driving. It's hard to say, I'm just going to go live off the land and walk away from it all.
Well, I think there's a pretty big gray area between, drink only water that you saved in your personal rain barrel and figure out how to put strictures on the internet that make it work for you. And I think, some of these solutions actually are market solutions. So I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they have lots of unsupervised time on their tablets because I also have lots of unsupervised time on my tablet, and I seem to be an okay functioning person. And I use Amazon's free time, which restricts content to an age-appropriate level. I also, in my own life, use productivity tools that shut down my social media.
My kids have so many hours and they have to call me if they want another 30 minutes. But the thing is that doesn't help me with my privacy, my privacy data. And
so
I think that's
I
one
do
of the
think
things people are talking about when they talk about regulation.
So I do think that there are some appropriate roles for government here, and one is privacy. I think that there's been this interesting conversation that's happening where all the tech companies say, well, you signed that terms of service. You gave us permission to do all the things we're doing with your data. And other people are saying back quite reasonably, yeah, no one reads those. It's ridiculous to think that that was anything that looked like informed consent. And I think there is space in that area for everyone to do better, and also for the natural expectations about what will be done with your data to be dictated by the courts. So I think this is something where enough lawsuits are going to sort it out, and that's going to be expensive and annoying. But that's
lawsuits and the market coming up with new products. That's sort of your...
Yeah, and I understand that's not a magical answer, but I think all the magical answers are lies. I think all of the answers, the idea that somehow that we can write laws that will make Facebook only share true things, or that we can write a law that will make it so that your camp forms are available in print in the office or something, which by the way, they almost always are. Again, you can opt out, you don't because it's convenient. And I think the flip side is...
Not really. I just filled out a form for my kid to go to New York next week, and I was like, now this new app that does school tours has all our info. It kind of annoyed me. But we have two really big things we have to cover before we turn to everyone else. One is hate speech. So if we leave it free, technology, open, we cannot deny the fact that we have this massive amount of hate and radicalization of people through the internet. And I would guess that you're going to say, well, people were always radicalized, but the exponential growth of radicalization seems to be something that's in discussion. Where do you land on that?
Well, people were always radicalized. No, I mean, I think there's a visibility question which does increase the impact of radicalized individuals, right? Even if there aren't actually more people who are on the very, very extremes who are willing to do extreme things, if we are all looking at them all the time, which we are right now, then they matter more and they become a bigger social problem.
And remember that Facebook, Twitter, you yourself talked about Reason TV, they're all moving into video. They know YouTube has the youth market and they're all moving into video social media.
Yeah, although we've also seen lots of publications that pivoted to video, now pivoting to dust. So I think there's...
But video does radicalize faster than words.
I mean, I think, this is what people said about television too as a medium, and you could argue that it did happen, right? But this idea that if we show violence, it will beget violence. This is also people said about video games. If we let kids play violent video games, they will become more violent. This is what people say about porn. If you let people consume more porn, there will be more rape. In fact, we are currently living through a decline in violence that is unprecedented in human history. And so it turns out that theory that like if you see bad things, you'll do bad things is, if not wrong, at least complicated. It is at least not entirely right.
Do you have any ounce of concern over radicalization through the internet that has no
Of course.
guardrails?
And so I think that what happens then is people choose to be in spaces where they are consuming this information or not. And I think that, there are lots of people who have stopped watching cable news because it's garbage, right? I mean, there are lots of people who now get their news from an app on their phone. No offense to people who work in cable news. There are lots of people who have stopped looking at Twitter because it makes them anxious and radicalizes them. And I think you can't rely on the radical elements in society to opt themselves out. But I do think that, we are, and this is something we even saw with this last shooting incident, there is always now a discussion of, do you share the name of the shooter? Do you share their manifesto? Do you put that out there? Do you give them the publicity they crave? And I think the fact that we're talking about that at all actually is a really good sign. The fact that, there is an evolution of norms to not put it in the mainstream of the conversation, but also not to pull it out of the conversation entirely. I mean, to make it illegal to publish the manifesto, as they did in New Zealand, I think is manifestly the wrong approach. That's a great way to hyper-radicalize the fringiest fringe and make people, quite rightly, feel discriminated against and censored.
To do what? To publish it?
To make it illegal to publish it.
To make it illegal to publish. I love your faith in humanity, I have to tell you.
I do have a lot of faith in humanity, but I don't think it's required. I think you can have zero faith in humanity, and you just have to remember that governments are humans too. Governments are made of humans, and I have zero faith in governments if I have zero faith in humanity.
So
there's no pairing.
To be rid of government?
So there are libertarians who are anarchists, but not all are. Most libertarians in the American sense are quite gradualist about it. They would just say, listen, I would like to legalize marijuana first. Maybe we'll get to cocaine and vending machines, but we don't have to start there. And I think that is by far the most common form of American libertarianism, is just people who say, there are some areas that we should be able to agree. The harm is so tremendous, both on the practical level and to rights or to the idea of liberty. Let's just get the state out of this thing.
I have so many questions I need to ask you about pro-choice, and I need to ask you, about where libertarians sit on immigration.
I can give you the super short libertarian abortion answer, which is there are both pro-life and pro-choice libertarians, and here's how it goes. Pro-life libertarians say the state has limited functions. One of them is to protect human life. That's a life. The state should protect it. Then there are pro-choice libertarians, who are the far more common subset of libertarians. Most libertarians are pro-choice, who say prohibitions consistently fail, and they create black markets and bad effects for the people who suffer under them. A prohibition on abortion will harm women, and it will fail in its goals, and it will create bad effects for the people who suffer under it. And that we want to maximize the realm of individual choice, and this is a question of the woman's choice. So it comes down to an empirical question about whether a fetus is, in fact, a rights-bearing life or not, but there's a libertarian rationale on both sides.
We have to cover one more topic. Private and public spaces.
Okay.
So on our way here, we talked about public schools, public colleges, private schools, private colleges, and we have these provocateurs that have been coming onto campus. If you want to go viral, if you want to be celebrated today for your views in a very fast way, a college campus is an excellent place to do that, because all of the young people are holding a phone, and they all are going to live stream it, and they're all going to share it with their friends. So there have been arguments made that this sort of agent provocateur is a strategy by some to have their issues go viral quickly. And therefore some campuses talk about limiting those. And then we get into the free speech conversation. Where do you fall on that? How do we deal with these provocateurs on campus without stifling free speech, because universities are all about free speech and free ideas and exchange of ideas, as you and I are having right now.
So, I mean, I actually will admit to having had something of a change of view on this recently. So I used to be kind of in, I would say, a pretty traditional mold of just saying, you know, what you just said, campuses are places for free inquiry. If people want to come and speak, you know, they should not be shouted down and not be banned from campus, and that, you know, it's good to facilitate and support dialogue. I had a conversation with a current college student about 6 months ago, and he said, listen, nobody on a college campus goes to a speech to find out what the person who's speaking thinks. That's not how the world works now. And it did used to be, right? It used to be, if you wanted to know what someone thought, like, often a relatively efficient way to answer that question would be to go hear them speak. And that's just not true anymore. If you want to know what someone thinks, go watch their TED Talk. Go follow them on Twitter. Go, you know, read an article that they wrote, which you can find by Googling it. Readily available. So the idea that viewpoint diversity is being stifled just because a sack of meat isn't saying the words through the air in front of your face is, I think, like a very old-fashioned view. At the same time, I think this is now a symbolic battle, and I think the symbolism is important. I think the symbolism of letting diverse views onto your campus in an appropriate formal environment is still there and is still relevant. And I would like it to be true that campuses have people that 90% of the people on campus think is a gross monster come in, just because they, you know, they're humans, and humans should see each other and interact. Like, we're, you know, there is some benefit to that. But I think the specific question of how will the kids these days be exposed to different views pretty dramatically misses the point. I do think it's now just a culture war, and I think the side that wants dissenting voices on campus should win, but I don't think it's actually about people knowing things or hearing arguments for the first time.
Will you write about that sometime soon for us?
Sure. Should I use the phrase sacks of meat?
Sacks of meat. I thought it was actually pretty provocative. I got it.
As soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, it's lunchtime.
I've actually really enjoyed this conversation. I wish we had more time. I'm going to let some other people ask you questions, but thanks for being so forthright, and I hope you'll come back. So we're going to take some questions. Anybody who'd like to ask a question to Catherine? Yes.
I fashion myself as a moderate liberal, or perhaps a knee-jerk liberal. But I have tendencies, when I hear about libertarian policies, I agree with some of them, if not many of them. No doubt you've debated moderate liberals on many occasions. As a shorthand, you kind of touch on this, but as a shorthand for me, what are the 3 or 4 areas where you and I would agree, and where are the areas typically that you and I probably would part ways? Sure.
I will stereotype you aggressively in this process, so if I miss the mark, I apologize. So I think, you know, lots of libertarians actually do see themselves as the moderates these days, and that's, you know, always a sort of funny high ground in American politics. I'm the real moderate. But I think, the place where a traditional libertarian and a traditional moderate American liberal would agree would be to say, civil liberties are important, and that means, sort of in the broadest sense, free speech, free assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of exchange, freedom of, just sort of your basic Bill of Rights stuff. I think that we would agree that in general, the, law enforcement and the criminal justice system broadly are currently too large and too powerful and need to be reined in. And I think we would agree that, I don't know these days if moderate liberals would agree that the current fiscal and budgeting situation is out of hand, that we are in a tremendous amount of debt, and that's problematic. So I will add a bonus thing in case you don't agree with me on that, which is to say, the idea that people who want to come here should be able to come here and make lives here. The people who want to become Americans should be able to become Americans, and that they should have the same rights as other people who were born here when they come here. On the other side, I would say we probably disagree. I think broadly speaking, capitalism is a successful system, among other things, for improving the lot of the least well-off in the world. and that the evidence for that is 1 billion people lifted out of extreme poverty in the last 20 years, almost exclusively due to the increase in global trade. And I think that is generally something that the modern American moderate liberal will not agree with. That person at this point is fairly skeptical of capitalism as a system. Broadly speaking, I think tax rates are too high, and that if tax rates were reduced, many people would see benefits from that, not just the very wealthy. And I think that our current welfare system, broadly understood, including Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, is on the verge of collapse, and that significant reform is needed and not in the direction of putting more people into the system.
I have a question on vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
And as you may know, Ron Bailey wrote a piece recently, and it's sort of further away from where Rand Paul was in terms of how we communicate vaccines ethically. The three major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, and FT recently have been, shall we say, pro-vaccination and even against some of the free speech pieces that might be where the anti-vaxxers are. So my question is, I wrote an article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago with others at Georgetown in the law school and UCLA School of Public Health, calling for not only federal, shall we say, mandates or stronger work over the states, but even more importantly, either whether it be voluntary or something on free speech, such as Pinterest has done to take stuff down, that other groups would be. So I'm curious where reason would be on this, both from Ron's perspective, your perspective, and then what do we really need to do to keep the progress with vaccination in this country?
Yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, first of all, I am extremely pro-vaccination. I vaccinated my children. Almost every libertarian I know is the same way. In general, libertarians like technology. We do not value things that are natural for their own sake, and vaccination has clearly been a force for good in the world. There is no doubt about it. To deny that is, to me, to deny some very clear objective truths. I think that, broadly speaking, the equilibrium that we had in our country for a long time worked, which was mandatory vaccination to participate in public life. And I think that's a little bit different than mandatory vaccination, period. Although the lines were never clear or rational, right? So this is, you have to be vaccinated to attend public school. You have to be vaccinated to, go to summer camp. You have to, and so, at the sort of local or state level, to make vaccination all but mandatory was a pretty functional compromise for a very long time. I think that the rise of anti-vax pseudoscience and sentiment broadly is poisonous. I think that to restrict speech about it would be even more poisonous. I firmly believe that when you put something underground, when you make it illegal, you make it stronger and more dangerous. I think that the question is different for private platforms. I think if Facebook wakes up tomorrow, she said as if Facebook is a person, if Facebook decides tomorrow to censor every single anti-vaxxer, that's okay with me. That to me is consistent with American values of free speech, and I wouldn't like it. I would get off of Facebook if that happened, because I would think that Facebook is no longer a platform that represents my values. But I don't think it would be illegal, and I think it might actually generate a social boon. I think there's a huge difference between that and mandating it. I think there's a huge difference between that and an agent of the state saying it. To me, the existence of Jenny McCarthy, if I had a gimme, I'd get Hitler, but if I had two, maybe her. I really think that it has been very, very bad for society that she and her ilk have gotten so much ground. But at the same time, I certainly don't support restrictions on speech. And I don't think that federalizing this question is going to help. I think it's going to radicalize the radical further, and I think it's not going to yield better outcomes by and large at the actual compliance level.
I couldn't possibly agree more with everything you said, except a couple of things. I'm not sure why you differentiate between communism and fascism. And the second one, because I failed to find the difference. They both exterminate people at large numbers. And the second one is when you open the borders to all of anybody who wants to come in, and you still have the safety net, what prevents the entire world from moving forward and getting there?
Sure. So yeah, first of all, I think, communism and fascism are both totalizing authoritarian systems, and so in that way, you're right that they are extremely similar. I think reasons to differentiate between the two, but in terms of should libertarians oppose both, yes. On the question of open borders, I mean, this is something that has bedeviled advocates of more open immigration for a long time. I mean, first of all, no one's debating open borders. That's not an actual conversation we're having. What's happening right now is that we're restricting legal immigration. There are fewer legal immigrants through all avenues in the last 2 years than there have been in many, many years prior. So first of all, I would just love to see dramatic lift of the caps on all forms of legal immigration. I think that's a great way to deal with a lot of this pathology, and it's not something Republicans are currently open to. It's barely something Democrats are even open to at this
Can you
point.
say that again, because I think that's an important differentiator. There's not actually an argument on open borders.
Right. So the idea that we might have true open borders in this country is not very likely to happen anytime soon, and that's not the debate that's happening on the Hill. The two things that are happening on the Hill are how do we, what level of legal immigration is optimal? And my answer is a lot more. And then the other question is, what do we do with the problem of illegal immigration, both the people who are already here and the people who want to come in and are coming in every day? And to me, this actually gets back to the same answer that I gave for the abortion question, which is prohibition fails. Prohibition fails. When people want things badly, like to come to this country, they will come here. And the question is just how many costs we're going to impose on those people while they're coming, after they get here, and what the second order pathologies are. For instance, the fact that 100 miles around the border, even American citizens have reduced civil liberties and reduced rights to refuse search. For instance, the fact that we are going to wind up with some kind of e-verify system where you need to get government permission from a federal database to work. You have to prove who you are. I don't know about y'all, but my general experience is that governments are not great at keeping databases. If anyone's ever tried to, fly and been in line behind someone on the no-fly list who doesn't know why they're there, you can see that. I also am wary of government databases generally. I don't really think it's a great idea to have, for instance, a huge database of people who are mentally ill and therefore can't buy guns, because it doesn't seem like a great idea to have a huge database of people who are mentally ill curated by the state. So I'm very wary of large lists curated by the state. I think that is the thing that is coming with immigration. That's just a libertarian bugaboo on the side. Back to the central point is that I think the existence of a social safety net is also not going to go away. Milton Friedman is often quoted as saying, if there is a robust social safety net, we need to reconsider a commitment to open borders. I actually think he's somewhat misquoted in that context, and Shikha Dalmia wrote a piece about that in Reason, if you want to check it out. But I think, right now, again, we have a squishy middle muddle through compromise. And the answer is, you come here, you check all the boxes, you do the legal immigration thing, and it just takes a while before you're eligible for benefits. I could even go so far as to see something like a guest worker program, again, temporary, just if that's the only thing that's holding us up, there are compromises that get us through. Not everyone who shows up on day one is eligible for every public benefit is a thing that is already true and that people generally accept. But also, again, we're just not talking about throw open the gates and anyone who wants to come here, come in. We're just talking about moving closer to something that's better.
Will Reason endorse a candidate?
No.
Do you endorse?
We're a 501c3, so for legal reasons we cannot. And we are libertarians, so for personal reasons we do not want to.
And I'm going to let one more question, then we're going to wrap up. So one final question.
You mentioned a trending story on the website, and you brought up the mental health issues with databases and guns. Is there any portion of gun control that libertarians would endorse?
The one-word answer to that is no. The slightly wordier answer to that is actually, just to make it a trifecta, the same answer as the other two questions, which is that prohibitions for things that people really want fail and impose huge costs along the way. And I think that's, it's a hard answer to contemplate when we see a tragedy that happens because someone has misused a gun. At the same time, there are a lot of guns in this country. And if your goal is to reduce gun violence, to try to reduce that number in a substantial enough way to make an impact on those gun death numbers, I think will result in more gun deaths. And I wish it weren't the case. I wish it weren't the case that people would
Why would there not be more gun deaths?
Because there'll be armed resistance. I mean, like restrictions on future sales are not going to make a significant impact on gun death numbers.
Do you think that taking away people's right to own a gun or buy a gun is going to create a resistance where people will get shot?
Yes. And it's not a threat, it's just a prediction. I mean, truly, I don't own any guns. I live in the District of Columbia where, despite the Heller decision, that's nearly impossible. I'm not even really one of those gun libertarians, There's a bunch of kinds, and I'm not that kind. I'm I like Uber libertarians, not the gun libertarians, but we have plenty of those on staff, and the vast majority of guns in this country are used for peaceful purposes, and I get why it feels like something we should be able to solve, but I actually I can't see any form of gun control that both significantly cuts down on actual gun death and that doesn't cause a backlash.
You realize, though, that we have more gun deaths in schools than any other country.
Yeah, we have more guns than any other country.
And can we solve that in any way?
I mean, so one example here is we have drug-free school zones, right? We have special laws that keep drugs out of schools, just like we have gun-free school zones. And in both of those cases, one of the major impacts of those laws is that police officers entrap people in those zones to increase their sentences. So whether or not it's not at all clear that any of those laws actually reduce the presence of guns in schools. This is just an example, right? It's not the only possible remedy, but it's not at all clear that any of those laws actually reduce the presence of guns in schools. But what they do is create racially disparate impacts on people in the surrounding communities, where they wind up for possession of drugs or guns that would have been either fully legal or more legal outside of those zones. They wind up imprisoned for longer with harsher sentences. I think well-intentioned laws to protect children are well-intentioned, and I appreciate that, but I also think they can have really negative secondary consequences, and lots of efforts at gun control fit in that category.
There's so much more we could talk about. I wish we had more time. One thing I like to ask people, and I'll go first, is what they subscribe to as news. Given the revenue models are dying. I subscribe to the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the MIT Tech Review, the Atlantic. How about yourself?
I feel like that's an unfair question to ask journalists because I get it all for free, man.
That's true. We do here too.
Yeah, I subscribe to the giant stack of magazines at my office.
Okay.
What do you read? How about that? What do you read?
I read, all the same stuff you would guess, mainstream newspapers, other magazines of opinion, including Mother Jones, which I think is an incredible publication, and I have huge amounts of envy about their investigative work. The Nation, the New Republic. Used to read the Weekly Standard, R.I.P. But my recent fave is New York Magazine, which I think is...
There's some good reporting in the last
There's
election.
surprisingly good reporting in there.
As well.
I have some questions about the Teen Vogue,
Come on, it was
semi-transgressive explainers. But Stella Bugby is a little bit goals for me. So when Reason becomes a lifestyle magazine, we're just going to rip off
Let us know.
New York.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.